So I want to just do a really, really basic overview of the plant, how it works, and why it matters as far as regulation goes. So as a plant, the species is Cannabis sativa. L stands for Linnaeus, if you were wondering who's the taxonomist or the biologist who first came up with the name. There are major varieties, sativa, indica, and ruderalis. Sativa and indica are the most common. They're basically cultivars or strains of the same plant, but they're sort of used for different things. Ruderalis is very rare and not used very much. Chemicals that matter to people are in trichomes, which are these little crystals, so the little stalks, basically, little sticky stalks on the leaves and on the buds. And what those are used for, and the reason they're sticky, is because they're on female plants, and the pollen that's released by the male plants is then caught by these little trichomes, and the chemicals that form the resin is how it makes it sticky to catch those, and that's how the plants reproduce. So that's why we have, when people talk about sticky weed, it means it has a lot of trichomes, a lot of resin, and the chemicals that people care about are in the resin. The cannabinoids are the major chemicals that people care about. THC is the major psychoactive cannabinoid. There are other ones too that have some psychoactive properties, but the science is sort of still being worked on to figure out exactly how that all works. And cannabidiol, CBD, is the major medicinal cannabinoid used for anti-inflammatory uses or anti-epileptic, other uses, but there are a lot of cannabinoids. In fact, the major ones are about 16 of them. The minor ones are over 100. So there are a lot of cannabinoids in these trichomes in this plant. It's a very special plant in this way. There's also terpenes and terpenoids. Terpenes are basically in many plants any plant that has a flavor or a smell is because of terpenes. So those are chemical compounds in the plant that cause a certain smell or a certain taste if you're eating it. And so marijuana has some very distinctive terpenes. Some people describe it as piney or skunky or lemony or whatever. It depends on the way that you cultivate it. But the smell and the flavor when you ingest it is due to those terpenes and terpenoids. So you're not tasting or smelling the cannabinoids, but you are the terpenes. There's some interesting science and research being done right now called the Entourage Effect. That's when you have certain cannabinoids combined with certain terpenes or certain levels of the two, that they might have different effects on the human body, which I personally think is really interesting, because otherwise terpenes aren't typically considered to have any effect other than just aroma and flavor. But the science is showing that in combination with certain cannabinoids, I think is really compelling. And then industrial hemp is another use of the crop of the cannabis plant. I guess the big federal part, the federal law that I'll just talk about real quick, is that I hope everyone knows, but marijuana is a Schedule I drug, so it's illegal federally. It means you can't do anything with it. You can't grow it. You can't process it. You can't smoke it. You can't eat it. You can't do anything. You can't cross across state lines with it. But it's legal, or decriminalized at least, in Michigan and about 35 other states. So, but federally, the plant was removed from the schedule if it has less than 0.3% THC by volume. So if it's not psychoactive, then it's legal. So CBD is now legal, right? So you'll see CBD at Family Video or at gas stations or at some milk store in Lansing. I mean, I've seen them all over the place where it's just, hey, here, buy some CBD, and it doesn't have to be just for dogs. It can be for humans. Although there aren't any wide-ranging guidelines as far as the testing requirements for CBD. So my suggestion when people say, can I sell CBD? I say, yeah, as long as it's tested, although that's not really a requirement. I'm just saying you should watch out for that because you're still ingesting it in some form if you're taking it for back pain or whatever it might be. It's still a chemical, it's still been grown, and without getting too much into it, there are reasons why you'd want to have testing done on this plant. I'll get into it a little bit later. But industrial hemp is I guess in the industry you talk about hemp versus marijuana which is defined by the level of THC. So less than 0.3% THC is hemp, more than 0.3 is marijuana, because marijuana is psychoactive, hemp is not. You would have to smoke a semi-truck full of cannabis to get high off of industrial hemp, right? but it's all from the same plant, the cannabis sativa plant. Just some breeds, the way you can shock the plant with certain like levels of different nutrients when you're growing it can raise or lower the THC levels, and that's how you can have industrial hemp. Hemp is a very versatile product. You can use it for oils, fibers, paper, building materials, all kinds of things. Cannabis is not quite as versatile because you're just going to ingest it. Okay, as far as how it works in the body, there's an endocannabinoid system. It's built into your body that you have cannabinoid receptors. So those are generally in the gastrointestinal or in the central nervous system. The CB1 receptor, so these are actually like little, essentially protein structures in our bodies that are naturally made to interact with cannabinoids. So CB1 receptors tend to be in the central and peripheral nervous system. These are if you're ingesting marijuana and you get high, the THC is attaching to those cannabinoid receptors, and that's what's going to your nervous system and makes you high. Other medicinal uses, especially there are some nervous system CB2 receptors, but also in the gastrointestinal system. So when you have people that are taking cannabinoids for appetite suppressant or appetite stimulants, for example, depending on which ones, those are the receptors that chemical is binding to. So we have a natural system in the body that's made to interact with cannabinoids. That's what they are. Forms of cannabis that people ingest are marijuana. That's the herbal form. I just mentioned that the difference in THC is what sort of is marijuana versus hemp. Keef is the powder. It's actually powder of the trichomes themselves. Hashish is resin made from the trichomes. You can extract the chemicals and have tinctures or hash oil, which can be known as dab or shatter. Shatters tend to be hash oil that has been sort of congealed and hardened, so you hit it and it shatters like glass. And then infusions. So there are infusions being like put into a gummy bear or a brownie or something like that, right? So there are a lot of forms in which people use marijuana in all different forms, or pills. I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can do this. But this is how it works in your body, and this is how you get it. I'm not giving instructions here. I just have had a lot of questions about like, hey, can you just give me the basics? So that's why I'm giving you the basics. Any questions about cannabis before I move on? Okay. And if I may not be able to answer, but I try. Marijuana laws in Michigan. So there are three major laws that we should know about. The MMMA, Michigan Medical Marijuana Act, was passed in 2008 by voters, and that basically just set up the framework for use of medicinal marijuana by people. And cities basically cannot regulate any use that's associated with just MMMA. I'll talk about all these in more detail in a moment. The MMFLA, Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act, was passed by the legislature in 2016. That allows for the commercial supply chain and again, importantly, the testing of medical marijuana, and that was done by the legislature. Cities have to opt in. If they don't opt in, then they're automatically opted out. MRTMA, which is Michigan Regulation and Taxation of Marijuana Act, was passed by voters last year, and that was allowing for recreational possession, consumption, and also the commercial supply chain. For recreational end use, though, cities have to act to opt out. And that's a big difference. So there are like 1,700 municipalities in the state, and many of those municipalities, right after November of 2018, said, oh no, we don't want recreational, regardless of what our voters said in some cases, we're going to opt out. So they have to take action to opt out. If they don't do anything, they're automatically opted in. Why this matters to the state is that the state is going to start accepting licenses in November, and if a city doesn't have an ordinance on the books, it's automatically opted in. So I'll talk about that in more detail later too, and the Grand Rapids City Commission is just discussing now how to get involved in recreational. All right, as far as the MMMA, the personal medical use of marijuana, I mentioned it was passed by voters in 2008. It allows for patients and caregivers. A patient is someone with one of, I want to say 12 or 13 conditions that you have to say, yes, I've been shown, a doctor has agreed with me that I have this condition. May I please have a prescription for marijuana? Then you send in that form to the state. They send you a card, and you can get marijuana up until recently only from a caregiver. So a caregiver would grow marijuana plants, in their house. They can serve up to 5 patients, not necessarily in their house, but usually in the house. They can have up to 5 patients. They can grow 12 plants each per patient, or the patient can grow their own. What's very funny to me about that is that 12 plants creates a lot more than 2.5 ounces of marijuana. So a lot more. I mean, you could potentially have a really well harvested or cultivated plant can produce a pound. So the moment you start snipping off those buds, you could potentially be over your legal limit, which has led to some issues, including the creation of a black and gray market. As of recently, we had one licensed caregiver in Grand Rapids. Can't tell you who they are or where they are, but there was just one. But we have a lot of patients, including about a little bit over 10,000 in Kent County alone, 280,000 in Michigan. Also had a lot of comments saying, okay, did all those patients, are they really patients? Or are they just want to smoke weed and they got the card for it? I can't judge that. But we have seen some research that's suggesting that the number of card holders is probably going to go down once recreational becomes widespread. I mentioned that cities may not regulate in general. That's because of a court decision last year, actually in Byron Center, where the I can't say this on camera. Okay, so basically, the city, the municipality had passed an ordinance that said, okay, we're going to regulate your ability to be a caregiver in these ways, and the way that they had written the ordinance kind of ran afoul of the way that the law was written, and so the caregiver said, I think that your ordinance isn't working, and took it to court, and the court agreed and struck it down and basically said, hey, you're a city, you cannot regulate land uses related to, if it's only to do with MMMA. So if it's personal medical use, if you're regulating caregivers or patients, you can't do it. So we had an ordinance on the book since 2008 or 9 that actually regulated things, and we removed it right away because we used to have it as a home occupation. Said, yeah, sure, you can use this as a home occupation, no problem. But then that's also helped make it more difficult for us to track, so we only know there's one licensed caregiver, but there used to be several because we actually had home occupation licenses and we could track and work with them, but we can't now. So that's MMA. I usually go over it pretty quickly and don't have much to say because we don't regulate it in the city, so I can't tell you too much. Any questions on that?
How much does that license? The caregiver license?
I'm not sure about the caregiver. I believe it's $100. I'm not sure on that though, honestly. All right, MMFLA. So the MMFLA, Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act, was passed by the legislature in 2016, and that allowed for municipalities to allow up to 5 license types in the city. Grower, processor, provisioning center, secure transport, and safety compliance. Grower, obviously growing plants, processing, taking those plants, and making it into something else, be it any one of those forms that I mentioned earlier, and then the provisioning center being the retail point of sale for those products or for the raw flower from the growers. Secure transporter is the only way that any products can get between growers, processors, and provisioning centers unless they're all together on the same property, which is allowed. We're seeing that more often. And then safety compliance facility tests plants or process products for safety, for potency, for homogeneity. There are a lot of reasons why you want to test. So here's real quick, I was mentioning that earlier. Why do you want to test? Cannabis is a very interesting plant in that it takes elements from its surroundings and brings them in. So you can use cannabis to remediate soil. If there was a gas station that leaked, you could plant cannabis and it would pull the chemicals from the soil and help it get better. I wouldn't say smoke that because it'll blow up in your face, right? But the same thing. Actually, in Ukraine, I think it's Ukraine, Chernobyl, right? The Chernobyl site had a ton of radioactivity in the soil, and they've been planting cannabis to help remediate that soil. Also, something you should never use, that end product, but it's helping to slowly remediate that area, at least along with the other issues that are going on there. So, heavy metals, residual solvents from processing, pesticide use, chemicals that were in the soil, all that stuff can end up in the cannabis plant. So it's very important for growers to then get their, I mean, they're going to be growing typically in much better surroundings than out in Chernobyl, but you can still end up with some bad things in the cannabis plant. So this law provided for testing facilities and requires testing. It doesn't require it for caregiver plants, which has led to some interesting issues now as commercial facilities are rolling out, because the commercial facilities are saying we're getting undercut by these caregivers who are, because the caregivers are actually allowed to sell their product now to provisioning centers, not just to their patients. They can sell their excess product because they have excess product. But the issue is that the growers are going, look, I'm doing all this work and I put together this facility and someone growing in their backyard in their house is undercutting me. Do you really want me to succeed here? And the state has been saying so far, well, yeah, but in the meantime, we just need to make sure there's enough product out there for patients. So there's some interesting dynamics going on at the state level. What we've seen from other states is that that kind of arrangement over time stops, where the caregivers essentially still have their patients, but that's it. The growers end up taking over the commercial side of the business, and the caregivers aren't as happy, but the growers are. Grand Rapids opted in on July 24th last year. I mentioned we have to opt in, and otherwise we're just by default opted out. So Grand Rapids opted in. We amended an ordinance in December. It went into effect in April. I'm going to come back to how we do all this in Grand Rapids in a moment, but I want to touch on MRTMA first. MRTMA, MRTMA being Michigan Regulation and Taxation of Marijuana Act. That was passed by voters last year in November, went into effect in December. And that allows for possession, use, and home grow of marijuana for recreational purposes. You can have 2.5 ounces on your person. 2.5 ounces of weed is a lot of weed, but you can have it on your person, or 15 grams of concentrate. You can have 10 ounces in your residence per person as long as it's locked up. And then you can grow up to 12 plants per person. Same thing with other states when we're looking at what's happened in Oregon or California, Washington or Colorado especially, that where they allow home grow, it tends to not be so great for the growers, except that the home growers never get their product tested and tend to have a lower quality end product than the commercial growers do. So commercial market still tends to be dominated by the growers, but there is that home grow component. And again, because you can have 12 plants per person, you're going to be growing a lot of weed and going to have a lot more than your legal limit as soon as you start harvesting. You can't gift to people, you can't sell to people unless you're a licensed retailer. But there have been all kinds of interesting cases where somehow this stuff is getting transferred, and somehow people still keep getting seeds, which you can't actually buy in the state, but they're coming across state lines somehow. But whatever. I've heard that European seeds are the best, but I don't know actually. Does not allow private sale, right? Does not allow driving under the influence, and does not allow transfer of more than 2.5 ounces. So yes, you can grow weed in your basement or your backyard as long as it's fully enclosed and not visible, so you have to go in your basement. And then, but if you're going to give something to somebody, you can only give them 2.5 ounces, and you cannot drive under the influence. That makes sense, I think. There are some new license types, a lot of equivalent licenses from the medical facilities as far as the Michigan regulation. As far as this act goes, there are equivalent license types from the medical. So you still have safety compliance, you still have secure transport, grower, processor. But the provisioning centers, the equivalent is called retailer. We've had our city attorney's office has said, hey, these are different land uses because they have different neighborhood impacts. So we're going to consider them different uses altogether. And then there's also a use or license type called micro business, which is a small grow, small being up to 150 plants, and also have a processing lab and a provisioning center, a retailer operation on site. So yes, these are smaller than some of the big grows. I mean, a big grow that we just approved actually down at Hall and 131 is going to be about 15,000 plants. So these, you can have a very, very large grow, or you can have a smaller grow, 12 plants in your basement or 150 plants as a micro business. But that's a new license type that came out of MRTMA, and we will be opting in over the next couple months in some form. I'll talk about that more in more detail in a moment. The MRA, the Marijuana Regulatory Agency from the state, released administrative rules in July, and they added additional license types. Excess grower, so when you have more than 13,000 plants, you then would get an excess grower license. A designated consumption establishment, which is on-site consumption of marijuana. Temporary marijuana event, so people talk about hash bash. Hash bash would be considered a temporary marijuana event. We could have temporary sales and consumption at this event of marijuana, and then a marijuana event organizer that would actually host that event. So I'm going to get back to those too. Some interesting considerations from MRTMA is that, and sorry, this is the Recreational Act, right? Is that until December 2021, December 6th, only Michigan residents are allowed to get the Class A grower, so up to 100 plants of recreational, or micro-business licenses. It's interesting because it doesn't really say what residency means or how you can prove it, and it appears that you just have to show you're resident at the time of application. So I know that I've talked to some potential applicants who are concerned about that, saying, great, someone's going to come in from Colorado or Chicago or whatever and just move here, get their lease, and say, look, yeah, I live here. And then they're no further along than they were before. But it is what it is. And also, interestingly, Class B and C grower, processors, retailers, and secure transporters, those licenses can only be issued to medical marijuana licensees. So we have people in town, for example, who are like, I want to be a recreational licensee. I didn't feel like the medical round went so well. I didn't have my stuff together in time to get an application in for medical. I'm going to be shut out of the market because only medical marijuana licensees can get licenses for recreational. I can't tell you how I feel about that personally. I mean, in some cases I go, yeah, that's legit. In some cases, yeah, you should have had your act together. But like, that's an issue, at least, that we're hearing a lot from locals, especially, saying this could be a problem. But that was from the Act. There was, in the Medical Facilities Licensing Act, there were some significant capitalization requirements. In order to get pre-qualified to get a license, you'd have to show that you had so much money on hand. In some cases, for a small grow, that'd be like $150,000. For a large grow or provisioning center processor, it was more like $300,000 to $500,000, and 25% of that had to be liquid. So that was also considered a barrier to entry to the industry. So in the Act, they removed those capitalization requirements, hoping to encourage smaller businesses or people that weren't as well capitalized from getting involved. Interestingly, I've had some conversations with some business support organizations with some folks interested in getting in the industry, and they're going, it doesn't matter. The capitalization requirements at the end of the day don't matter. It doesn't matter that they remove these requirements because I still need that much money to get a business started. But at least it takes away one sort of regulatory barrier. Maybe you still need money, but let's say you need $146,000 to get your small grower started. You don't have to show that you have $150,000. At least you don't have that extra step now for recreational. So that's considered a step forward by some people I've talked to. Everyone has a $6,000 state application fee, and then that's to submit an application. And then you have an initial and renewal licensing fee that ranges from $4,000 to $40,000 a year. And that depends on basically your sales volume, if you're a provisioning or a retailer. If you're on the lower end of that, maybe you pay $20,000 a year, and if you're on the upper end, you pay $40,000 a year. So there's sort of a sliding scale of renewal fees, and that's meant to be in comparison to others. So this is all as far as recreational goes, and this is from the state. All right, as far as marijuana in Grand Rapids, I mentioned early on that Michigan Medical Marijuana Act, we added it as a home occupation locally in 2008. After the court decision in 2018, we said, great, well, can't do that anymore, took it right out. So we don't regulate MMA uses at all. I've had questions from people saying, could I buy a warehouse and have a bunch of caregivers inside that warehouse? Is that legal? And I say, you're a caregiver under MMMA. I don't see why not, as long as you're meeting all building mechanical, ventilation, all that kind of stuff, all those codes. But the moment you turn around and start selling those products to people other than your patients, you're running afoul of the law. So, but that's the state's problem, essentially. So we don't regulate MMA reuses at all, is my whole point. NMFOA, we did opt in, I mentioned in July 2018, we amended it in December. We allow all the licenses without any cap, but the limit on the number of facilities, potential facilities, is based on the separation distance scheme. I'm going to talk about that just for a moment. For provisioning centers, growers, and processors, those are sort of considered core industry license types. And those are subject to those separation distances, and those all have to go to the Planning Commission for special land use approval. The safety compliance facilities and secure transporters are generally very non-impactful uses, and so we say, go ahead, you don't need to worry about separation distances. You can just set up in one of the zone districts where you're allowed, and we'll take care of your application on a staff level, not going to the Planning Commission level. Very briefly, the separation distance requirements are a mess. I shouldn't say that. Not officially. As a staff person administering, it's kind of a nightmare, but it's effective, right? And so it limits. We have about 67,000 parcels in the city. It limits down the number of parcels that are feasible to potentially put a marijuana facility on, about 1,200. That doesn't mean, though, that they can all be on. There can be 1,200 facilities. And the way we limit that down is that we say, okay, you have to be 1,000 feet from a park or a publicly owned park or playground, 1,000 feet from a religious institution, 1,000 feet from a state licensed substance use disorder program like a rehab center. However, the Planning Commission could waive that separation distance if they find it's okay. There's also a requirement for that same 1,000-foot separation distance that can't be waived from child care centers, public private K-12 schools, and other marijuana uses. So any other marijuana facility. Now, again, these only apply to growers, provisioning centers, and processors. And that can't be waived, except for that marijuana facility, if you happen to both be commercially zoned provisioning centers, in which case you have to have a separation of 2,000 feet. So it is really complex ordinance and really complex separation distance. Let's also add one more on that. Okay, you also need a 1,000-foot separation distance from residentially zoned properties, but not as a radius, just along the same street, on the primary street frontage. So it's been an interesting ordinance to administer. We do have a map. I'm not going to pull it up right now. I could later if you want. But we have a map that sort of shows, here's where we think is our suitable properties. Here's where all the other applications are and their status. And then we have these little separation distance lines around all of them to try to help people understand, where could I potentially locate, and also help the public say, where are these going to be, what's been approved, what's in the process. And we also have a big table with all those applications. We started accepting applications in March of 2019. Oof. We got 89 applications. We had a draw in April 26th to set a queue, and so it was like a lottery. And basically, based on the lottery, we said, okay, well, here's in what order you're going to go to the Planning Commission. We accepted 80 of those 89 applications into the draw. The 9 had problems for whatever reason. And then we had the Planning Commission review the first applications in May. They've approved 11 that are effective. They approved 3 more recently on September 12th, but those approvals aren't effective yet. It takes about 2 weeks for an approval to go into effect because you have an appeals period. So out of those, and we've received several more applications, about 14 or 15. So right now, we have 94 applications in the queue. We expect to have 95, except that because of that separation distance requirement from another marijuana use, when one application gets approved and it's within 1,000 feet of another application, that other application gets knocked right out. So going back here, we've had 28 applications that have gotten buffered out by other applications. We have 11 here that have been approved. 8 of those are standalone provisioning centers. 3 are growers. The 3 more that got approved recently, I think 2 of those were also growers. So right now we have basically 5 growers gonna come online. We have about 3 or 4 more growers in line to get approved down the road. Hopefully, they want to get approved, I should say. Yeah, we have 5 more growers, I should say. No, take that back. 3 more that are going to be in the queue. Regardless, we have a lot of applications, right? 3 of them have gotten denied, and one of those is being appealed actually on Thursday. It's denial. So we're working through these. Because of that buffering, even though we have 95 or 94 in the queue, we've lost, 28 are gone because they've gotten buffered out by somebody else. If we sort of game it out and say what could probably happen here, we think that we'll probably get through all the applications by January, possibly early February at this point. So we've been working through. Typically we have the Planning Commission review 3 per meeting, and that's twice a month. So that's where we are right now as far as medical goes. Any questions about any of that I talked about? Okay. As far as recreational goes, I mentioned that per MRTMA, we had those Class A, B, and C growers, processors, retailers, which are like provisioning centers, safety compliance, secure transporter, and microbusiness. Those were out of the Act. Then the administrative rules also allowed for those new classes. When we try to compare them to the medical, and it's kind of interesting. So medical says Class A is 500 plants. Recreational says, no, Class A is 100. Medical says Class B is 1,000 plants. No. Recreational is 500. Class A or Class C for medical is 1,500, and recreational says 2,000. So there's kind of this weird dynamic going on where, well, what is the end use of your plant going to be? And so you actually have to track from the moment it becomes a seedling, I think it's over 8 inches, you can say, okay, what am I licensed for? Am I going to use this for medical end use or recreational? And that's probably going to depend on the cannabinoid structure, right? So if you're going to have a high THC product, it's probably going to be a recreational end use. Higher CBD or other cannabinoids that are used for medical use, it's probably going to be a medical end use plant. So you have to be licensed for every plant based on this structure. And then you have your 13,000 plants system. So if you want to be a bigger grower, over 13,000 plants, you have to get that excess. If you want to do recreational, you have to have, 5 licenses of 2,000 plants each. So you have 10,000 recreational plants. Then you have to have 2 licenses for medical. So you have a total of 3,000 medical plants. And then if you want more plants on top of that, more recreational plants, you can go back and get access for a license. So there will be that. The big grow I mentioned that has 10 licenses is all medical at this point, but they might determine they want to have recreational as well. So they're going to have to change their licensing classes that they're using. Then you have the microbusiness that I mentioned that's only recreational. Processor is whatever, but they're going to have a license if they want to process plants into, again, by the end use of the plant. Same thing with things like safety compliance lab or secure transport. So if the safety compliance lab is going to test medical products only, it only has to get a medical license. If it also wants to test recreational, it's going to have to get that license as well. And then same thing with the secure transporter. You're going to have both licenses, or they're going to have to be very careful and say, what are you going to use that for? Oh, recreational? Great, I don't have that license, so call someone else. So it's a very interesting time right now. I mentioned the designated consumption event or location. That's based on the administrative rules, the temporary marijuana event, and the event organizer. Those are also only recreational licenses at this point. And I can make this all available too. I saw people in the back taking pictures. I can put it on the web. In fact, most presentations that I've done, I put on the web. GrandRapidsMI.gov/marijuana. Easy to remember. And everything is on there. All the presentations, all the talks, usually videos are all on there. It just takes a moment to sort of figure out where everything is on there. But also that map I mentioned, and the table, all the applications, it's all on there. So feel free to contact me or go on there if you need to get those items. So here's how we're opting in. The state of Michigan said, look, we're going to start accepting applications on November 1st. If you don't have an ordinance in place, you're automatically opted in. So many cities have said, okay, we're opting out. In some cases, because we hate marijuana. In some cases, they're like, ooh, we're just not ready yet, or we're not sure, so we want to temporarily opt out. In some cases, they just want to opt out to play it safe. So there are all kinds of reasons why people have opted out, but I think it's about half the municipalities across the state right now have not taken action. So we have a flurry of activity right now because all their lawyers are going, oh my God, guys, you're going to be opted in November if you don't do something right now, because ordinances take a while to pass. So what we're doing is introducing a licensing ordinance, which doesn't mean much. It's an opt-in. It's an opt-in, and it will be in effect by November 1st. But what it does is it says we're going to allow certain uses. We're going to require a license for certain types, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those types will be allowed, because that comes from zoning. So we're just going to say, so if that use at some point is allowed, will it or will it not require a license? But that's enough to be considered an opt-in. So this is kind of the city commission's way of saying, we want to opt in. We're not quite sure how it's going to play out yet. We want to work on that. And then we have some other ordinance requirements, particularly as far as sustainability. Any marijuana use is going to have to do basic energy reporting with the 2030 district. Growers are going to have a sustainability plan. They're going to have high efficiency lighting. And we just sort of say, this is what high efficiency means. We're not prescribing what kind of lighting, but higher efficiency lighting for half the plant canopy. And then they have to do a whole building energy audit. Because growers have been found to have a significant energy consumption impact, like significant. 4% of Denver, the city of Denver's entire energy use is marijuana growing. Like, that's a lot of energy, right? I mean, Denver is 700,000 people, and 4% of their entire city's energy use is for growing. We were talking with Consumers Energy, and they said, guys, we've heard about brownouts happening when cities aren't ready to, when the grower turns on a switch, there's a brownout happening. We don't want that to happen here. So that big grow that I keep talking about at Holland and 131, they're going to have a phased approach, and they're not going to fully build out until 2021 because consumers can't build the substation until then that they're going to need to handle that energy draw. So I think it's 12 plants, no, 4 plants growing in your basement. This also restricts home grow because 4 plants has the equivalent energy consumption around seeding, like from seed to maturity, as running 29 refrigerators in your basement for the same amount of time. So it takes a lot of energy, and people don't necessarily realize that, and so they try it and go, oh my gosh, I can't do this, and they stop. But the growers are set up, and the growers tend to have more energy efficiency already because they've done the business plan, they've done all the numbers, and go, oof, I really need to have higher efficiency stuff. Same thing with water efficiency, but we don't have requirements in there right now. For all you architects out there, look into universal design. If you're going to work with marijuana applicants, every marijuana licensee is going to be required to build to universal design standards. And I know that's a touchy thing because there aren't really it's not quite like ADA. But we've been working with disability advocates. We've been working with the cannabis industry on this, and they've been saying, yeah, of course. One thing that's very, very, very nice about this industry is that we have very, very willing applicants. They're going, whatever you throw at me, man, we'll make it work. So we're saying, great, universal design, sure, no problem. We'll make it barrier free. We're going to make it so good. These counters are going to be the right location. Everything's going to be perfectly accessible. And so we're going to try it out and see what happens with this industry. And same thing with environmental sustainability. I could see these things becoming more than just the cannabis industry. We'll see. And then also, we need to have a way to deny or suspend or revoke a license if needed for enforcement purposes. Because right now, all we have is a zoning ordinance, and the recourse, if there's a zoning enforcement and there's not a license, is that you can revoke land use rights. But land use rights in this industry are gold. So we didn't really want to have to go down that direction if we don't have to. So having this licensing ordinance allows us to say, okay, you screwed up. We're going to revoke your license or suspend it for some time. But we're not going to go so far to revoke your land use rights, because then your land is essentially worthless. And I shouldn't say worthless, but it's now only worth the same amount as every other piece of land in the city, right? And no one wants that because they went through the process to get marijuana approval. So any questions about that? Okay, so here's our timeline. We're introducing this ordinance to the city commission next week, September 24th. Their proposed date of adoption, assuming there aren't any major changes, is October 8th, which makes the ordinance become effective. They want to have a 6-month period after that, after the effective date. This was not intentional, I promise, which means that on April 20th of 2020, we start accepting license applications. And seriously, it wasn't intentional, but that's just how the time worked out. That will get us into to have an effective ordinance to opt in by the time the state starts accepting license applications in November, and that gives us a few months to actually have an adequate public process to talk to practitioners in the industry, say, hey, what do you think the rules should be like, to talk to the public, to the city commission time to give their ideas and feedback, and so we can craft a good ordinance that is reasonable, is fair, and actually have good land use rules in place, and also determine which uses themselves should be allowed, even if they're already in the licensing ordinance. So that's our timeline for that. Yeah, there have been questions about, well, what if there's been a medical facility that's been approved before this, like as early as the first one was approved in May, so it was effective in like early June. Are they going to have to wait until April to get their license? No, the zoning approval will act as a temporary license, but they'll still have to go get a license once licenses are available. They just don't have, they can continue to operate with zoning approval. And so that's where we're at with the timeline. Any questions about that? Okay. Summing up. MMA we don't regulate. Commercial medical, being MMFLA, we do. We have several facilities, both in the queue and approved. Recreational, we're opting in some form. We'll consider licensing ordinance next week and probably start accepting applications in April of 2020.